On today's video, you're going to see me renovate our guest bathroom. Now, this is an awesome project. It was fairly easy, just took a little bit of time, but was relatively inexpensive overall. Now, you can see from these beginning photos and videos that it is pretty builder grade. Now, I will note I did do some casing around the door already. I'm going to keep that and repaint that, but I wanted to remove these 5 1/4 inch baseboards from around the room. I did install these a few months ago, but I'm going to put something a lot nicer in its place. It goes without saying it's awesome having a little helper, especially a 2-year-old with tiny hands, to get in all those little spots that you need to. But after we removed all the baseboard from the bathroom, I went ahead and removed the mirror and then went about using just a little pry bar to remove this escutcheon plate from around the water line for the toilet. Now you'll see me showing how I'm shutting off the water line first before loosening it all up with a wrench, just to be sure we don't have any water leaks, because I do need to remove the water line to be able to get behind the toilet to install some of that paneling, which you'll see in just a few minutes. Now, it's important to note I am removing all of the outlet covers, both for the rocker plates or that rocker switch and for the outlets. After doing that, you do need to, and I went ahead and used a stud finder to mark all of my studs in those locations. I am going to secure most of the paneling using these studs, so it's important just to make a line that goes above my install line to make sure I secure everything. I'm using this piece of MDF as a mock-up. It's a 1x2 on top and then a 1x4 on the bottom. I take that total measurement, which is about 4 1/4 inch, and just go right off the top of my light switch and mark where the top of that trim is. After I do that, I set my tape measure on the ground to then mark the exact height, or approximate height, that the entire paneling is going to rise up off of the floor. So it's just about 60 1/2 inch, which you'll see me mark here. After that, I'm going to put a line all around the room to make sure that I have a uniform height whenever I'm installing this paneling. So taking a level, keeping everything level, I went ahead and marked that. Then I just did the reverse. Since I know the very top of that little MDF mock-up, where that top of the trim will be, is about 4 1/2 inches down, I marked 4 1/2 inches down from that top line and then used that to mark all the way around the room, which you'll see me doing here. Now, this is key and very important because I'm going to use this as a reference line whenever I'm hanging the beadboard in just a few minutes. Next, I went about taking measurements off of the vanity top to create a little template to be able to fit my beadboard panel piece in here. Now, hang on with me. It is going to make sense in just a minute when you actually see me install this thing, but mostly and under normal circumstances, I would actually do the easiest piece first just to kind of get in a groove, get in a rhythm. But for some reason, this piece had just been building up in my mind. When I continued to think about how I was going to cut this, I was feeling stressed out and I didn't want to waste a whole bunch of material making wrong cuts. So I used this piece of thermoply, which you can see here. You can buy a sheet of this for pretty cheaply at the store. And I made a custom template just so I could go and check the fit of the piece before I ever installed it. So then once I positioned it in the bathroom, I realized, okay, it actually fit. This is great. And I removed that piece and took it to the garage, sketched the outline on my beadboard panel before cutting this whole thing out. It goes without saying that whenever you are cutting any type of trim, because I'm using all pine in this, it's all select pine, I would recommend that you use a fine finish tooth saw blade. It's going to make the cuts a lot cleaner and allow you to be able to have a much more aesthetically appealing project and not have a whole bunch of tear out from a crappier blade. Now, I don't have a straight edge here, so I just used a piece of MDF as sort of a substitute for a track tool and cut out each one of those little grooves in the board. Then, of course, I had to resort to some hand sawing just to remove those bottom pieces that were needed and worked my way up the entire paneling piece. Now, with that being said, beadboard is a great selection. We utilize this because beadboard is historic. A lot of houses wouldn't have, or rather historic houses, wouldn't have drywall in them. Of course, they would have plaster, or a lot of intro beginner level houses, starter homes way back in the day, would have beadboard wall paneling. And while this beadboard is not the thick beadboard that would be used in older projects, it does help to bring back a little bit of nostalgia into this whole bathroom, while also allowing us to elevate it just by utilizing raw natural material. Now, of course, we're going to paint over this whole thing and prep it super well so it looks awesome. What you see me doing here is I did cut down and along the line here around the vanity, which you'll see in a minute, using my circular saw. But to make sure that I got a perfect fit, I did use a hand sander and just went through and sanded down the line perfectly so that it would align flush right up against the vanity. And let me tell you, it was an awesome feeling when I finally got that thing installed. Now I wanted the top of the beadboard to actually be level and touching this piece of the door casing. So I used a little 1/16 inch shim to bring it up ever so slightly off of that 4-inch splash on the countertop, checked my level, secured it to the wall, and just held it there in place while I used a 18 gauge brad nailer to nail this into the studs. Now you can use a 16 gauge, you can use an 18 gauge, but the paneling is so thin. I think it's 11/32 of an inch, and then the drywall is 5/8, or no, it's ½ inch. It's so thin that just using a 2-inch long 18-inch brad nail for these super thin pieces was very, very easy to do. And frankly, I use those 18 gauge nails because they're just easier to fill. It's a little bit easier to make those holes disappear. Now, I did remove the back of the toilet to be able to slide this paneling piece on there, and you saw that I took a first attempt to try to fit it in there, but although I had used my hole saw to cut around that little escutcheon for the water line, it wasn't working. So I decided, okay, I'm going to move this water line over just a little bit, because as you can see here, they actually didn't tape it in right. It's supposed to be flashed in a different way, but I removed some of the screws, wiggled it around in place, and I thought, okay, I'm going to wiggle this in place to be perfect so it'll actually be able to fit in there. But as you can see, I was just a little bit off. And so I thought, okay, let's rinse and repeat. Let's do this again. I'll just bump it down just that little bit. It'll fit perfectly. This will be great. And attempt number 3. All right, once I slid it in there, still, I was off just a little bit, but we got to keep going. Got to keep trying to do what we need to do for this. So I finally just decided, okay, I'm going to cut this hole a little bit bigger. I'm going to take more precise measurements. I'm actually going to tape it all up the right way. And after however many times, 4 or 5, I don't know, I've lost count at this point. I took the paneling, slid it down in there, and it stressed me out a little bit. I had to work in a piece here, shimmy the corner there, use a pry bar on one side, kind of push down on the pry bar just to work it around the vanity, squeeze it into the top, and thankfully it fit. Then I just ran that brad nailer all along the side and through those studs just to secure it to the wall. After that, I moved on to a much simpler piece, which is just that little rectangular portion directly over the vanity. I used a bead of CA glue along that overlapping seam just to join the two pieces together, and then sent brad nails into the studs. Now you will notice as I installed this paneling, I'm not using liquid nail. That was an intentional choice. I just thought, okay, the paneling is so thin and the stud spacing is only 16 inches. I have more than enough surface area that needs to be covered to really hold this panel to the wall, and it ended up turning out pretty great. Now, as if by magic, a window suddenly appeared in the bathroom. No, I'm totally joking. Now, I actually did install this whole window, this whole setup. I will show it to you in my next video. The only thing I didn't do was the texture around the drywall, because it actually is an art form, and my friend who did the drywall, I forgot to tell him not to put on these little corner bead pieces around the window. So I had to rip them off and then bring in another piece of beadboard and slide it in there. Now, instead of pre-cutting it, I'm going to show you another option for what you can do. Now, to hold these panels on, I just ran a brad nail in, and then along the framing of that window, I just took a router bit and just hogged out that whole space. It did take a little bit of time, but overall it gave me a nice even edge to work around. Once I finished that, I took all of my measurements inside to build out my frame for the casing that I was going to install around the window. Now, this is what's really going to bring it all together. It looks amazing, but it did just take some preparation in advance. So got everything all put together to then use my select pine board to cut all this down. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm basically going to make the frame for the window and then slide it into the casing. I used select pine here. Now, going back to what I was talking about when we were talking about the beadboard earlier, I'm using pine for a few different reasons. One is it's a lot cheaper than anything else I can get. And I just did go to my local hardware store, purchase this pine. You can do the same thing. You do need to take a little bit of time and make sure that you check all 4 sides of the piece, make sure that it's not bowed or warped or twisted or anything like that. So I took careful time in selecting all of my pieces. Now, the sides and the top of this casing are going to be 1x4s. They're actually 3.5 inches wide, but based on my measurements, I had to rip them down just a little bit more to fit snugly into that framing space. So I took the top and the side pieces, cut them to size, and then this will actually be my windowsill piece. Now I'm going to have to cut it in such a way where I have enough of an overlap to allow for about 1.5 inch reveal on either side of the vertical pieces. Okay, that was a lot of words that I just said, but it'll make sense. Just hang on with me here in a minute. So what I'm doing here is I'm pre-marking on my sill piece exactly where that 3x5, or excuse me, that 3.5 inch wide 1x4 piece will be slid down on there when I do the actual casing around the window framing. Then I use my miter saw, the table saw, and just a little bit of hand sawing to perfectly cut out those pieces for this windowsill. Now you're going to see me pre-assemble everything, and this I thought was a lifesaver. I just used a 1-foot-long speed square to angle up those corners, make sure everything was square exactly the way it needed to be. And you'll notice up at the top and on the bottom, I'm doing butt joints. And again, I installed this in a very specific way just so that we could actually make all those dimensions fit. All right, now you're gonna see, okay, is this making a little bit more sense? I slid this piece into the window, and then I'm just marking around the spot on the beadboard that I need to cut out to make this piece flush up against the drywall. This is important because while I could just install the windowsill and the trim directly on top of the beadboard, it looked great. But once I got up to the top where the drywall is, there's going to be an 11/32 inch gap between where the board needs to be and the wall just because of the thickness of this beadboard. So I decided just to go ahead and nestle everything in so it was touching the wall, and the finished product looks really, really good. So just trust me, okay? Reserve your judgment for later and know that this is going to look beautiful. All right, after I did that, I test fit the piece because again, I had to cut in both sides of that windowsill, and thankfully everything looked really good. I then made sure that everything was both plumb and square before sending several brad nails into the casing along those studs just to keep it in place. Now you may notice, okay, who is the random man outside the window? If you stick around for my next video, you will find out exactly what that random man is doing. And long story short, he's installing the brick around the exterior of the window, which, hey, you got to know your place, and I know that I'm not an expert brick mason, so I decided to use an expert. Now you'll see me here, I'm making cutouts from the edge of that window casing in 3.5 inches for this 1x4 piece of pine. Then I cut my vertical pieces on the miter saw, just making sure everything was aligned exactly the way it needed to be, and then took them inside to install. Now again, I would recommend that you double and triple check your measurements on these things because proportionality is key, and it's gonna look great as long as you just take your time to do it right. I then took a break and came back a little bit later that evening to install this header piece and then the skirt piece that'll go underneath the windowsill. Now it goes without saying, accuracy is key, so to be accurate you have to have good measurements. So I measured the top of where the header would go, and then also the bottom of where those vertical pieces are for my skirt piece. This will make sense why it's important for these to be accurate as I then show you this. Alrighty, so hang with me here. Hopefully this makes sense. I'm going to do the best I can to explain this. So the top piece, the middle section, is going to be 29 and 5/16 inches wide. It is a 1x6 MDF piece. Then the top piece is going to be a 1x2 that we are just going to add 1 inch of measurement to 29 and 5/16. We add an inch because on either side I'm going to have a 1/2 inch reveal. Then for the bottom piece, this bottom piece, I took a 1x2, but I rip it down to be a 1/2 inch thick and 1 inch wide. And then the total length measurement is going to be a 1/2 inch extra on top of 29 and 5/16. That 1/2 inch allows me to have an extra 1/4 inch on either side of the reveal. Okay, did that make any sense? No? Yes? You can always go back, right? Rewind, I don't know, slow it down, but an easier thing to do would just be watch what I'm going to do, and I'm going to show you exactly how to do this. I used some setup blocks to go ahead and rip down this piece, the very bottom piece, so that would be a 1/2 inch thick. I really love setup blocks. The ones that I use, I think they're 20 or 30 bucks on Amazon, and so far they've really served me well on multiple home projects. Then I just use a different setup block to make this bottom trim piece 1 inch thick. Now, after I cut each individual piece, I went ahead and I pre-marked everything. So on that bottom piece, it needs to have a 1/4 inch reveal on either side. So I marked a 1/4 inch on either side. Then this is the very top piece of that header. I marked a 1/2 inch on either side and then went about installing them. So you'll see the bottom piece, I just took a little bit of wood glue, secured it with brad nails, and then popped them in there. Then again, making sure that I lined everything up perfectly with my preset markings, I then installed that header piece. Next, we went ahead and cut the skirt, which, I mean, that's not super complicated. Since the skirt does touch the beadboard, I just did what I did before, right? Marked everything out, took a multi-tool, and removed that piece. It did take a little bit of time, but again, it's well worth it as it makes everything tie together so perfectly. Then grab that piece, used a mallet just to snug everything exactly in place the way it needed to be. In this instance, I actually went ahead and used a 16 gauge brad nailer for all those thicker pieces. I forgot to say that if you're going to install these thicker select pine boards, I would recommend that you use a 16 gauge brad nailer. Then slid that piece right there on the top and installed the header. Boom, man, that looks really good. Okay, remember what I said about liquid nails? So there was one little spot almost exactly where the seam was of those two beadboard pieces right up against the vanity that had just a little bit of a sag. And so I went ahead and firmed it up with some cedar shims, slid them in there, and then cut those shims down to be flush so that my top trim piece would fit on beautifully. Next, I went about cutting some of those last pieces of trim that I would install directly on top of the beadboard. The 1x2, you'll see here in a minute, will go on top of this 1x4, and the 1x4 will touch that beadboard. Now, as I thought about it more, I realized the 1x4 will actually look kind of weird if it's just touching the top of the beadboard. It would give me a weird edge. So I elected to cut a groove in the back of the 1x4 that would allow me to snug that 1x4 piece directly on top of the beadboard and just give it a really seamless line. The way that I did that was I set up my table saw with this little sacrificial fence and then set up my dimensions with my stop blocks that I have here. You don't need a dado stack saw blade to do this. You can just use a single saw blade like I did here and then slowly work that piece over again and again and again until you get this beautiful groove that will allow you to directly slide that beadboard piece flush up underneath, and then of course level everything out and send those brad nails in. I would highly advise that whenever you put that 1x2 piece on, that you keep the brad nail gun exactly like I'm showing you here. It needs to be perpendicular with that top piece so that you don't blow out a brad nail on the other side of that 1x4 you work so hard to dado out. Now, moving on to the corner pieces, it was extremely helpful to have that drywall corner be an exact 45 because it made these 45-degree angles that I had to make with my miter saw a lot easier. Then again, just making sure to be careful as I nail that very top 1x2 piece into that face piece of that 1x4 underneath. Using glue on those miter corners, I just again used a little 16 gauge brad nail to nail everything in place. Now that back piece, you can see on the right and left corner, there are little gaps there that I had to cut out so that it could snug up just to be a perfect fit against the beadboard. And then I used butt joints to install that trim work in the corner. I actually didn't miter it down. I came back later and used some wood putty, sanded it down evenly to make that corner look great. Now, the final part of install, I went ahead and I used 1x6 pieces for the baseboard, laid that piece directly on top of the flooring, and then used a level to check everything. And then I would use some cedar shims on spots that needed to be raised or lowered just to bring that directly up off the floor. I chose intentionally not to caulk everything to the floor because I thought it made the finish look a little bit nicer. Now, before I give you the grand reveal, I just want to show you where we started. Okay, nice little starter bathroom, very bland and boring, but with a little bit of hard work, it was an awesome opportunity to transform everything. And here you go. It looks great. I'm so happy with the way this turned out. My wife did an awesome job picking the colors for this. Now the wall we repainted, so that is Accessible Beige by Sherwin-Williams, and then the trim color is actually called Broccoli Brown. My wife found it online. We did darken it a little bit, and I really like it because it kind of pulls in some of those classic Craftsman colors. Normally, Craftsman homes have a darker wood tone that is stained. We didn't stain this because it's not stain grade, but I love the accents that my wife was able to pull in with these paintings. That shower curtain is kind of like almost a wallpaper moment in this small space. And then even the paintings that she selected were incredible and really pulled everything together great. So I hope you enjoyed today's video. If you did, like, subscribe, and I'll see you next time.